Our first presenter is Sarah Reiner with Gray Robinson. Sarah practices in the area of employment law and commercial litigation. Her employment practice centers on the defense of employment-related actions at the agency, state, and federal levels. She is well versed in the handling of all types of cases that may arise in your daily routines. We're very lucky to have Sarah speaking on the topic of key workplace issues in the time of COVID and beyond. So thank you, Sarah. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Peter. It's good to be here. Thank you guys for allowing me to join you for your conference this year. I'm sorry it can't be in person, but hopefully that'll be next year. So we're going to jump right in because there's quite a bit to cover. As Peter mentioned, I practice in the area of labor and employment law. And if you're an employer, then during COVID, you have had employment issues related to COVID, staffing, and any number of other things. We're going to move through the material fairly quickly, but I have provided just some key bullet points for you in the form of this PowerPoint. And then, should you have any questions or anything, hopefully I'll be able to get to some of those at the end. If we could go ahead to the first slide. The next slide. There we go. So one of the things we're going to be talking about first is key workplace issues during the COVID pandemic. And under this topic, we're going to discuss several things, primarily staffing and continuity of services, leave issues, workplace safety, medical screenings in the ADA, and then various things that we think are essential policies and procedures for employers to have. So let's start with staffing and continuity of services. And in terms of applicability, this is going to impact employers of pretty much any size. We're seeing it across the board. At Gray Robinson, we represent, small companies, 1, 2, 3 employees, to large companies with thousands or tens of thousands of employees. And uniformly, we are seeing issues related to staffing and continuity services, particularly in certain industries like the hospitality industry, the healthcare industry, and things like that. One of the things we have also seen is that employers are having to modify their recruitment and hiring policies and practices to make for quicker maneuverability and ability to hire to fill openings. They are also having to streamline their staffing and cross-train employees so that they can continue critical services and functions, even if an employee is diagnosed with COVID and has to be out for the requisite 14-day quarantine or something of that nature. One of the other things we are seeing an issue with in terms of COVID is voluntary workforce departures. And by that, I mean, strangely enough, employees actually coming into the employer and saying, I don't feel comfortable. I don't want to continue in this position because I'm afraid of exposure, and voluntarily resigning their position. We had one employer in the restaurant industry who actually had several employees come to them and say, I am afraid of public contact. I can also make more at this point on unemployment now that we have the federal credit. And so I want you to terminate me. Well, what some of those employees may not realize is that if you're asking an employer to terminate you and they have a position and a job that and work that is readily available for you, then you're still not going to be entitled to unemployment or reemployment, as we say in Florida, benefits. But that is something, strangely enough, that we are also seeing. Another area that has been impacted in terms of staffing and continuity is overtime. And employers are really having to analyze their budgets and their staffing to ensure that they don't incur overruns due to overtime. So when you have certain employees who are absent due to COVID testing or potential exposure or because they are taking an extended leave due to childcare reasons or the unavailability of childcare. We find employers are incurring overtime expenses that they wouldn't typically incur because other employees on staff are having to pick up those hours in order to keep the business operations going. So that's also something that we've seen during COVID in terms of the staffing and continuity issues. If we could move to the next one, thanks. Employee leave issues. That is a big part of my daily interaction with employers, is addressing employee leave issues during this pandemic. The initial questions right after it started in the enactment of the Families First Coronavirus Response Act were, what's going on here? What is this new paid leave requirement that we all have? And that applies to employers who have 500 or fewer employees, and it provides that they are required to provide them with paid sick leave in the event of certain things occurring. So for instance, I'll just give a couple of examples. An employee is experiencing symptoms of COVID and wants to get tested. Then the employer has to provide them with paid leave up to 80 hours. An employee has been told to quarantine by a healthcare provider because of an exposure, or has been told to or is required to quarantine under a state or federal quarantine order. Those things would also entitle an employee to paid leave. So those were the initial questions. What's going on with this paid leave? How do we incorporate this into the leave policies that we may already have? Those were the initial questions that we were getting. Now we are primarily seeing questions, and some of you may have these, on the expanded family medical leave portion of the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. And what that portion of the act did was it expanded paid leave and provided 10 weeks of paid leave for the specific purpose of childcare. If your child's school or normal childcare business or childcare worker was unavailable due to reasons related to COVID. Now that's important. We have employees or employers who are now opening their doors and are asking their employees to come back to work, either in the workplace or on a full-time basis remotely, and in various different scenarios. And what we are seeing is that a lot of our employers are struggling or experiencing this back and forth tug with employees related to childcare issues. And the expanded family medical leave can play into that. Now, the key here is if a brick and mortar option is available, if your child's school has opened or the employee's child's school has opened, then the individual is no longer entitled to the expanded family medical leave under Families First with respect to that childcare provision. Now, if the school district has opened, but it has only opened online and there's no brick and mortar option, then they remain entitled to the expanded family medical leave. One of the questions we're getting all the time is, Sarah, we have an employer or we have an employee who is concerned about their son or daughter and does not want to place them back in brick and mortar school or brick and mortar childcare business. And unfortunately, for the employee, they don't really have the option of making that election with respect to this specific expanded Family Medical Leave Act. Now, they can make that decision. For instance, I could keep my child out of a brick and mortar school. I'm just not going to be entitled to the paid leave if I do that. One of the other issues that we are looking at is the interaction when we're speaking with a client between the Families First Coronavirus Response Act and the leaves provided there and the employer leave policies. So that's something that also you should pay attention to. We're also receiving inquiries on how do we deal with vulnerable personnel. Vulnerable personnel, the individuals that the CDC considers to be most likely to have, a significant adverse action or adverse reaction to contracting the virus. How you handle staffing issues and leave issues with those particular personnel is a significant problem that employers are addressing. Most of the employers we deal with are, to the extent that they are able to, continuing to have those individuals work from home, if that's possible. In some cases, it's not possible, and they are providing unpaid leave if the employee does not want to return to the job. Sometimes it depends, of course, on the job. In the healthcare industry, it is largely all hands on deck with our healthcare providers. And so just because someone may be in one of those vulnerable categories, oftentimes they're still needed to fulfill their job duties because they just don't have substitutes to fill in for them. So this is one of the other issues that we are facing in various industries, and our employers are facing in various industries. Again, I've talked about the fact that these are kind of, to some degree, can be industry specific. So you're going to see more issues, I think, in terms of healthcare, hospitality, restaurants and hotels, places where you have considerable contact with the public or with individuals who may have contracted COVID. There we are seeing a lot more staffing and continuity issues, a lot more leave issues. We are actually seeing in some cases an uptick in hiring because of the staffing issues. We are also getting a lot of questions regarding the ADA and FMLA and the interaction of those laws with respect to COVID. Now, one of the questions I get with respect to the ADA is, if my employee has COVID, are they disabled under the Americans with Disabilities Act? No, not necessarily. We start with the premise that that's not going to be a disability in and of itself under the ADA. However, an employee inquiry can't stop there. So for instance, let's take an example. Joe Smith contracts COVID, and he is maybe one of those people who's in a vulnerable category. And as a result of contracting COVID, he has developed significant issues with respect to his lungs and pulmonary issues. And those issues could impact him to an extent that he would be considered disabled under the ADA. So in some cases, you may still need to do that ADA inquiry when an employee asks for an accommodation upon returning from an illness, from an illness or contracting COVID. So that is really going to be examined on an individual case-by-case basis. One of the other things I would remind you is that you need to look at the interaction of the Family Medical Leave Act and then also the ADA together. So the Family Medical Leave Act provides employees with typically unpaid leave of up to 12 weeks for certain serious healthcare issues that are personal to them, or to care for, a spouse or a loved one, as defined by the act. Now, one of the questions I get often is, between expanded family medical leave for childcare, and COVID testing, this particular employee has exhausted all of their family medical leave. And keep in mind that this expanded family medical leave for childcare purposes, it's not in addition to the normal 12 weeks of unpaid leave. If they use 8 weeks of expanded family medical leave, then that is 8 weeks taken from that total 12 weeks. So they don't still have 12 weeks later on when they return to work if something else happens. So we're getting questions on, once an employee runs out of their Family Medical Leave Act leave, can we just require they come back to work, even if they're still ill, even if they do have some other sort of serious illness or injury? And I'm not necessarily saying COVID. The answer to that is possibly no, because you also need to take the next step and engage in that ADA interactive process. And that is looking at whether or not the employee may be entitled to additional leave as a form of accommodation under the ADA if whatever medical issue they have would render them disabled under the ADA. Now, I've mentioned this a few times. Keep in mind that your Family Medical Leave Act is going to apply to employers with 50 or more employees, typically. Now, the Expanded Family Medical Leave Act for childcare purposes applies to employers with 500 or fewer. So even if you have 2 employees and would not typically be covered by the Family Medical Leave Act, you are covered for purposes of this expanded family medical leave for childcare. With respect to the ADA, that law covers private employers with 15 or more employees. And so that's really the number you need to remember when you're thinking about the Americans with Disabilities Act. Go ahead and move to the next slide. So let's talk a little bit here about workplace safety. This is absolutely a huge issue during COVID. And we are going to start by looking at certain issues of liability. So companies need to be thinking about liability issues with respect to employees, partners, and members of the public. So what are these 3 components? What does that really look like? So employees, that involves making sure that you have a safe workplace and work environment for your employees. Partners, vendors, people that you do business with, clients, you're also going to have to look at requirements that they may put in place to keep their employees safe, and have to consider how those interact with your own policies and procedures. So for instance, we've had one client who provides security services to different clients, and clients have contacted them and said, we want A, B, and C with respect to any future security staffing. And some of the things that they've requested are full-time set staff, so they don't want different people rotating in and out. They want to have the same individuals on staff. They want those individuals to undergo the same types of medical testing that their own employees are going through, or even greater medical testing than their own employees are going through. So those are some of the things that we see clients and vendors asking for from our employers. Employees, one of the big things we're doing with them to help protect them is we're putting specific safety policies and practices in place with our client employers. And by that, I mean, you're looking at a safety plan, and I'll talk about this in a bit more detail later, that addresses both on-site and in-office safety precautions, and then also off-location or on location at different work site, precautions that may be necessary for client locations, or, in the construction industry, a specific work site, handling of equipment, sanitization of equipment, and various different things like that. We're also looking at employee health monitoring issues. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have concerns about medical testing with respect to your employees, and rightly so, because generally, under the ADA, medical testing is only allowed in very, very limited circumstances. And even taking the temperature of an employee is considered medical testing under the ADA. Now, during a pandemic, some of those prohibitions are set aside. So during a pandemic, because you're really dealing with critical safety issues with respect to your workforce, certain testing is allowed that wouldn't normally be allowed. And some of that is, in fact, medical testing in the form of temperature taking, and also requiring employees to be tested for COVID. You can also require employees to leave the workplace if they are showing symptoms of COVID, or prevent them from even coming to the workplace if they are showing symptoms of COVID. So those are different steps that you could take with respect to employees, medical testing being a significant one. Now, there's a caveat with medical testing. And one of the things I want to talk about is the nature of the medical testing, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But let me run through this other list real quick. So there you've got employee health monitoring, office sanitization. That's one that's much more standard now. I think everyone is kind of getting those policies and procedures down. Frequent hand washing, having sanitizer available, requiring PPE, the wearing of masks, limiting the number of individuals who are actually working from the office at any given time. And then looking at, in the greater scheme of things, the bigger picture, looking at building issues like ventilation, common spaces, and maintenance. And those are all workplace safety things that are being addressed by employers during the COVID crisis. One of the other things I do want to mention is OSHA. OSHA released a guidance on preparing workplaces in the COVID pandemic, and it's actually taken and modified from something. I think it was the H1N1 pandemic that they created it for, and then they've modified it for the COVID pandemic. So that can be accessed on their website. And one of the key things that a lot of employers are not doing, employers that are subject to OSHA are not doing and should be doing, is recording potential work-related COVID illnesses. Now, the OSHA has made it very clear that COVID is a recordable illness and must be logged as an occupational illness, particularly in industries like healthcare, first responders, hospitality, anywhere where someone's going to have an elevated chance of exposure and contracting COVID due to the nature of their position in their jobs. So recording COVID illnesses and logging them as potential occupational illnesses is required by OSHA. And it is required and must be logged if three things occur. So number one, if the confirmed case, or if the case of COVID is confirmed in accordance with CDC guidelines, if the work, if it's work related as defined by the regulations, and again, that's largely going to be dependent upon the industry. So if there was an exposure to a healthcare worker or something like that. And then if the case involves one or more of the general recording criteria, such as the employee had to be away from the workplace. The illness necessitated that they quarantine or couldn't attend work. And that's just one example. And you can look at the regulations and OSHA guidance for that material as well, for those issues as well. Or you can also reach out to us if you have further questions on that. The next slide. There we go. So we're going to delve a little bit more here into the medical screenings in the ADA. So you need to look at both federal and state law. Federal law, you're really looking at the ADA. Some states have their own equivalent to the ADA that actually provide heightened requirements for employers and restrictions on employers regarding medical testing. And then also from a state perspective, some industries, for instance, like the Department of Healthcare in Florida, some are requiring testing of, for instance, nursing home employees, home healthcare employees, and things of that nature. And they have to go through mandated COVID testing with the department. Medical files, any kind of COVID testing results need to be kept in the employee's separate medical files. And for those of you who are unaware, the law requires that medical information not to be kept in the employee's personnel file. So you can't have their hiring application and discipline history and then just have the medical information in the personnel file. The medical information needs to be kept in a separate file in a separate locked cabinet. Screening questions. You'll see a lot of employers doing screening questions now for their employees. This can range from, are you experiencing COVID symptoms? And for that, you would look at the CDC, the most current CDC list. So are you experiencing COVID symptoms? Have you traveled outside the country during the last 14 days? Have you had a known COVID exposure as defined by the CDC within the last 14 days? So most employers are putting together those initial screening questions. I can tell you from my law firm, any guest who's coming to our actual office location, which is now reopened, is required to fill out a screening form and to answer those questions before they come into the office. We also have a temperature scanner that is in place as well. And a lot of employers are doing temperature scanning. Now, the important thing to remember there is that it's not a fail-safe kind of a thing. There are plenty of people who may be COVID positive who actually do not have a temperature. So, that is a caution. Don't think that just because someone's clear that they're absolutely, COVID negative. You still need to take those other precautions like frequent hand washing, wearing your PPE and your face masks. Now I want to talk a little bit more about the COVID testing, which I mentioned just a moment or two ago. And this is important because, the ADA, again, prohibits certain medical screenings. And although it allows for COVID testing now, it doesn't allow for all forms of COVID testing. It has to be a reliable test for active COVID infection. So a lot of you may have heard about antibody tests. Antibody tests are not a form of COVID testing that is allowed under the ADA. Why? Because the CDC has indicated that antibody testing is not accurate and not reliable for purposes of determining whether or not someone has an active COVID-19 infection. So, can an employer ask an employee to go get an antibody test? No, because that would not be a permitted medical test under the ADA. Can an employer ask an employee to go get a test for active COVID infection? So for instance, at one of the drive-ups where they do the swabs and they send, that, yes, you can. Or through department testing, for instance, in the healthcare industry and that kind of a thing. It has to be a reliable form of testing for it to be okay under the ADA. One of the other things that we are seeing is a problem with respect to return to work documentation. Typically, you can require, if an employee tests positive or they've been out, that they provide you with a clean bill of health, so to speak, by providing you with a return to work form from their physician. But a lot of physicians are trying to limit their paperwork because they've got too many other things on their plate. And so you're going to have to rely on less traditional forms of documentation with respect to your return to work documentation. Instead of being, a specific letter on physician letterhead or something like that, it may come in the form of an email. It may come on a stamped pad saying, clear to return to work, or they may not be able to get one at all. And then you're going to have to look at, okay, how long have they been quarantined? Have they been quarantined at least 14 days? And based on their position, excuse me, based on their position, do I feel like it's acceptable to let them return to work now after that quarantine? Next slide. Okay. Essential policies and procedures. Office safety is a huge concern. That's no surprise to anyone watching, I'm sure. So one of the things that we are doing frequently now is putting together safety plans for our employers. And that's important for a couple of reasons now. Not only to give employees specific guidance regarding the employer's expectations related to safety policies for COVID, but also to assure the employees that the employer is taking their safety seriously, to comply with OSHA requirements, and then also from a public perspective and a marketing perspective. And we'll get into that more in a moment or two. But what does your safety plan, or what should it really look like? Well, it should address the reporting of symptoms. It should instruct employees that they should not come into work and should immediately contact their HR professional or other designated representative if they are experiencing COVID symptoms. It should tell them what to do in the event they start to experience symptoms while they are already at work. It should provide practices and procedures for both an office work environment and, if it's applicable to your business, a remote work site. It should talk about what PPE is required, for instance, wearing masks, gloves, anything like that, hand washing, equipment cleaning, and sanitization procedures. It should also restrict the movement and number of employees that are in a specific area at any given point in time. So if you or your client has a business, or the insured has a business where they have, hundreds of employees, and so they typically have a cafeteria opened, they may want to close the cafeteria or designate specific lunch areas and stations and limit the number of people that can be in the cafeteria at a specific point in time. Same thing for like lunchrooms and things of that nature. Employees should be eating at their desks, or you should make sure that there's the requisite amount of space to keep everyone safe. So those are the types of things that you need to consider for your safety policy. And they're going to be different from employer to employer based on your needs, the number of staff you have, the nature of your industry, and any number of other factors. Network security is another big issue that our employers are experiencing during this COVID pandemic. And part of it is because so many people are working remotely. So first, there's the issue of whether or not the network and the infrastructure is sufficient to support that, and the changes that may need to be made in order to support more remote work at home individuals. And then there is the network security concern. And those are issues that should be addressed by your IT professionals. Teleworking, work from home, is prevalent now, whereas it used to be an all hands on deck. We want to see your face in the office. We want that interaction. Now, in large part, workforces are working remotely if they have the ability to do so. Now, of course, there are some circumstances where that's just not possible, but in large part, we've seen a huge uptick in teleworking. Paid leave and unpaid leave, employers are being required to be very flexible with respect to their leave policies. One thing that it's important to note here is whatever you decide to do, you need to do it uniformly. You need to treat all employees the same, because if you start allowing individual supervisors and managers to make decisions on an individual by individual basis regarding whether one person gets leave and another person does not, then you run into the potential of a discrimination claim, or someone saying, all of the females were allowed leave and none of the male employees were allowed leave, or all of the older employees were allowed leave and none of the younger employees were allowed leave. All of the employees who had children were allowed leave for certain specific issues and none of the others were allowed leave. So you need to look at protected classifications for employees, race, gender, all of those different things, and then factor that into how you manage your leave procedures. Attendance and tardiness, productivity issues, those are something else that we are seeing based on the huge expansion of teleworking. So employers are struggling with how they track the productivity of their employees when they are online and actually working, when they are just logged in but not necessarily working, what's going on in the background of the home while the employee is supposed to be doing their job and performing their job duties. And then employee monitoring. Now that so many people are teleworking, how do you handle employee monitoring that used to be done on a person-by-person basis? You could look around the corner and see what Bob was doing or what Susie was doing. So that's another thing that employers are struggling with. One of the things I want to point out right before we leave this is timekeeping. And timekeeping is critical. We have a lot of employers now who are allowing non-exempt employees to work from home. It is absolutely critical that those non-exempt employees, so employees who are entitled to overtime for hours worked in excess of 40 hours per week, it is absolutely critical that those employees still be required to record all hours worked. And that is where tracking employee work time is very important, particularly with the teleworking workforce. So just because Janie signed on at 8 a.m. to her computer, unless she literally is not capable of doing anything for her job until she signs on, you can't really use that as your clock, so to speak. Janie could have been reviewing documents at her desk before she actually logged into her computer. So she could have started at 7:30 in the morning. It's important for employers to take those things into account when they are looking at hours worked for employees so that they don't incur liability with respect to potential wage claims for minimum wage or overtime violations. So that's something that's very important. Now, the next area we're going to talk about here is key workplace issues post-COVID. And I see I've got a couple of questions here, and I will try and address those in just a moment once we get through the rest of this. So key workplace issues post-COVID, those include, changes to the work environment that we think are going to persist. They're going to continue, it's going to continue to require employers to make adjustments to workplace safety processes. There's going to be renewed focus on mental health and healthcare. And then I think we're already seeing the demands for transparency that have accompanied COVID. So looking first at this pandemic-related changes that we think are going to persist, teleworking. Number one on the list, we already see it happening. Employees who have now become accustomed to working from home don't want to go back to the office. And employees or potential employees and candidates who are out looking for jobs are looking for jobs that will allow them to telework. Don't expect this to change, because now that employers have been forced to allow teleworking, they're seeing and employees are seeing that it can be done. In many circumstances in which employers said, no, I need them right here. I need them in the office. I have to be able to see them and speak to them. And that's the only way this job gets done efficiently. Employers and employees are finding that that's not necessarily true. And so we expect it to continue after the pandemic passes. And that's something that employers should be prepared for. They need to be flexible with regard to work from home opportunities, and they need to put in place specific policies and procedures regarding work from home. So what is that going to look like for their employees? What kind of work and home environment is the employer going to mandate? Do you have to have a separate room away from any interaction with children, spouses, people knocking on the door and deliveries coming during the day? From a physical standpoint, how's it going to operate? And then from a productivity point, how do you track your employees and manage their productivity when they're not there in the office? Paid sick leave. Lots of the states, including Florida, has had several bills proposed regarding paid sick leave and requiring employers to provide paid sick leave for employees. In Florida, none of those have gotten through so far. None of those have been successful. They've all been stalled in committee. But we expect that trend to continue. So we expect in the next few years for paid sick leave to be mandatory to a certain degree. Alternative childcare arrangements. If there is one thing that has proven to be an immense struggle for everyone with respect to teleworking and the pandemic in general, it is childcare. And so we expect employers to begin looking at alternative childcare arrangements as well. And we have already seen some who are looking at contracting with different, setting up childcare within their offices or contracting with different childcare providers to help with childcare expenses and issues, and to make their workforce more comfortable in terms of returning to the office. So that is one thing we expect to continue as well. We expect employers to pursue alternative childcare arrangements. One of the things that has been a significant concern is social contact and the office culture, and how the office culture is changing as a result of the pandemic. And we find that employers are required to be creative in terms of how they maintain relationships with their employees and build the team structure that's so common to an office work environment when people are actually in the office. How do you build that kind of rapport between people when they're not coming in and seeing each other on a daily basis? And so social contact and the modern office layout and office culture is something that we think employers are also going to be taking a significant look at. And we anticipate that a lot of that may be more open concept from a structural standpoint than they have been in the past. Once we get back to work and people are more comfortable, we think they're going to crave, we think they already crave that social interaction. And so we think employers will be looking at that carefully as well. Next slide. Okay, so technology is another issue. Video conferencing. Some employers are setting up dedicated studio space, which is something that they haven't been done. Video submissions for bids and marketing pitches. We're seeing some of that as well. Security, and again, I touched on this briefly before, the need for improved internet access and networking and security. We're also looking at how the employer conducts training, and then also education in general. And we think there's going to be a lot more online training as opposed to let's set up lunch and have a group meeting. And, you know, everyone will have the seminar. And again, like the PowerPoint, we think there's going to be a lot more online training with employers. We think that relaxed dress codes are going to be here to stay for a lot of employers, particularly those who move to kind of a more work from home structure than they had in the past. And one of the reasons we see employers doing that is because there's an ability to realize certain cost savings when you're looking at a smaller blueprint in terms of office space. And so we think employers will be looking at that as well moving forward. Again, productivity monitoring, we already talked about that. And then business continuity planning. And this ties into the staffing issues that we discussed earlier during the presentation. And what happens when one of your key individuals with a key work function is out with COVID or for any other reason? There are a lot of employers out there who don't really have solid continuity plans in terms of not only their managerial structure, but also just their critical duties that employees handle on a day-to-day basis. And so we think there's going to be a much more focused look at that for employers. They're going to be going to their vendors and resources for suggestions on things like that. And then they're going to be cross-training employees so that they can juggle different tasks if someone needs to be absent or is out for any reason. So adjustments to the workplace safety processes. Some of the things that we're going to see there, again, it's not just exit signage and fire drills at this point. I know we've all done our share tromping up and down staircases, I'm sure, but plans are really going to be multifaceted and forward-looking. They're going to address both, as I said before, customers and clients, employees and vendors and suppliers. They're going to look at how do we keep each of those categories of individuals safe when we are interacting with them to provide our business services. So There's also going to be a focus on logistics and corporate maneuverability. Again, that ties into a couple of the other things I've talked about in terms of staffing and how you structure your office, deliverables, how people receive things, even down to we're seeing changes and a lot of startups providing delivery services. We're seeing it in the restaurant and hospitality industry. We're seeing it in the logistics industry itself. We're seeing startups to compete with FedEx and UPS and other businesses like that. So that's going to be another thing that we're seeing in the future. And in conjunction with that, again, there's going to be another safety and security piece to examine. So when you're looking at all of these vendors and suppliers and how you're structuring these things, you're always going to have to find what are the safety concerns or considerations that I need to think about in implementing this particular relationship with a new vendor or something like that. So the other two little bullet points here I think are fairly self-explanatory, and those are the focus on equipment and training with respect to safety. So again, if you have any special sanitization equipment, some employers are using things like, I don't even really know what you call them, but I call them blue lights. So blue lights to sanitize personal equipment and things like that are things that individuals may use on a regular basis. They're bringing in companies who do fogging to handle office sanitization issues as well. So those are all going to be important. And then again, looking at your essential and non-essential workers for evaluating those safety processes and procedures. Who do you really need to be in the office? Who can work remotely and thereby kind of decrease your risk in terms of potentially contracting COVID? Next slide. So health and healthcare. One of the big things that we are seeing is that COVID and the isolation that it has necessitated has had a significant impact on the workforce. And not only in terms of physical health, but also mental health. And that is something that employers are also going to have to concern themselves with, making sure that their workforce has suitable access to mental health care as well as physical health care. Their policies with respect to healthcare policies, be it through a Cigna or one of your standard healthcare, be it on the open market, those are all going to be, employers are going to be looking at the mental health component of what those plans offer moving forward. And we think that that will be a change to a change in their practices because it hasn't been as big a concern in the past. Medical testing, GINA, privacy issues, those are all going to continue to be a concern. COVID has been this blip in terms of employees being, I guess you could say, more amenable to medical testing, particularly if it's going to keep them safe in the workplace. But once we are through, I say that hesitantly, through the pandemic, and are at least, we expect those privacy issues, the medical testing, the GINA, and the privacy issues to be reevaluated again. And we expect to see a lot more pushback on some of those things from employees. And it's important to keep in mind, employers, keep in mind that all of those laws are still in effect and must still be complied with. With respect to things like the ADA and medical testing, there may be some leeway because of the pandemic, but employers still need to abide by all of those laws. And then employers being seen as a safety net. Again, we expect that to be to continue. It's the easiest way for the government to deliver on benefits and services. And so we expect employers to bear more of that burden as we move forward, rightly or wrongly. But that's something that employers should consider as well when they're planning their financial, when they're planning their budgets and looking at things like paid leave and things of that nature. Go ahead, next slide. We've already seen a demand for transparency, and that is reporting requirements to the government. So again, this kind of ties back to COVID and reporting to OSHA, COVID exposures and things of that nature if they qualify as an occupational illness. We're seeing demand for information on any significant outbreaks. We are seeing news with Amazon and major manufacturers and companies. So the media is still very much involved in monitoring COVID and providing that information to the public. The transparency of your COVID response as a business and on an industry basis is going to be very, very important. And this is something I touched on briefly before, but to wrap up on this point, corporate marketing of preparedness. And what do I mean by that? We've already seen this in commercials online and on television. And I think you know what I'm talking about, the We Care commercials. This is how we're protecting our employees. This is how we're protecting the public. These are the different things that we're doing to make sure you're okay and to carry on our business. And that's why you should buy from us. So we are already seeing a spin on the safety issues from a marketing perspective. And that's something that companies should also keep in mind. You know, it's happening for a reason, and it's happening because safety is at the forefront of everyone's mind during the pandemic. And so a look is going to look at not only the practical aspect of you know, first and foremost, we want to keep people safe, but they're also going to be looking at the public impact and the industry impact and the impact to their bottom line in terms of how they respond to COVID or how they are perceived to respond to COVID. And so that's what we're talking about when we talk about our demand for transparency and then corporate marketing. So I think I just have like 1 or 2 minutes here.